Flying an airplane in the mountains today can be challenging for an experienced pilot, but modern equipment and technology like terrain awareness systems and weather radar, as well as the newer airplanes themselves, can help mitigate the risks. Add today's pilot training to the equation, and mountain flying is still challenging, but it's much safer than it was in the past. However, flying in the mountains at night in the middle of winter can turn a challenging situation into a dangerous one, and it doesn't take much to turn a dangerous situation into a deadly situation. This was especially true 70 years ago, when navigation was much less refined than it is today. Mechanical reliability was not taken for granted, as it sometimes is today, and basic weather patterns and concepts were not fully understood. Crossing the mountains in a modern jetliner at 35,000 feet is rarely a concern today, but 70 years ago, a safe arrival at the destination airport on the other side of the mountains was not always a guarantee. The plane at the center of this episode of Radar Contact Lost was in a bad way. One engine was on fire. There were 3 others, but the plane was struggling to maintain altitude. In addition to the engine fire, it was experiencing turbulence and severe icing, and as I alluded to a moment ago, it was crossing the mountains at night and in the middle of winter. As if that wasn't enough, the plane was also lost. It appears the crew didn't realize they were lost, or at least didn't mention it to air traffic control, but they were well off course just the same. This alarming situation was taking place over Western Canada in a 4-engine propeller airliner in the middle 1950s. The plane was full, there were no empty seats. The passengers were likely unaware of the dire situation, though many had likely seen the engine fire and were aware that one engine was not working. I'll guess the mood on the plane had taken a turn for the worst, but before the engine fire, it was likely a bit celebratory, as the plane was returning from the annual Canadian football East-West All-Stars game the day before. The flight included 5 professional football players, 4 from the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and 1 from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. There was one official on board from the game as well. All the players on board were playing for the West, the team that won the game. Losing altitude as it was, the plane was getting closer and closer to the rocky peaks, cliffs, and vertical walls of the Cascade Mountains not too far below. It was rugged, hard, remote, and unpopulated territory down there. These were the circumstances encountered by TransCanada Airlines Flight 810-9 on the evening of December 9, 1956. Let's examine the details. The airliner, a Canadair North Star, was the Canadian version of the 4-engine Douglas DC-4. It was at capacity. There were 62 people on board, including 3 crew and 59 passengers. The plane was originally on course and proceeding normally on its route from Vancouver to Toronto, with scheduled stops at Calgary, Regina, and Winnipeg. The plane was just underway on its first leg to Calgary, perhaps only 20% of the way there. At about 35 minutes into the flight, the crew reported that they were encountering icing, and just a minute later, they began to encounter light to moderate turbulence. They were continuing to climb, and at this point were at about 16,000 feet, or nearly 5,000 meters. The crew had reported turbulence at 16,000, 17,000, and 19,000 feet. Some of it was heavy, and this should not have been unexpected by the crew. The mid-level winds were pronounced and running nearly perpendicular to the mountain ranges below. It's the perfect setup for mountain wave turbulence. At the time, the North Star had reached flight level 190. That's 19,000 feet, or at about 5,800 meters. It was then about 45 minutes from its departure in Vancouver. 19,000 feet is more than twice the height needed to clear the mountains below. And it was indeed mountainous. If it was needed, options for an emergency landing below would be few and far between. It was about this time that the crew noticed the engine fire. It was on the number 2 engine. This would be the one closest to the captain on the left or the port side of the airplane. Even though this engine would be behind the pilot and perhaps difficult to see, I'm sure the nighttime fire was readily apparent to not only the pilot, but the passengers as well. The crew shut down the engine and the fire was extinguished. Throughout this, there did not appear to be any undue concern in the pilot's voice. The plane was handicapped with one engine shut down and the accumulation of aircraft icing, and it was now beginning to lose altitude. Yet the captain, as noted on the radio by air traffic control, remained quite calm. Because of the fire, the pilot reported that he was turning around and heading to a waypoint called Abbotsford, a location southwest of the airplane and about 20 miles or 32 kilometers from the Vancouver departure airport. Air traffic control verified the plane had made the turnaround and was heading southwest, and then cleared the plane down to 14,000 feet. The troubled plane would then proceed via an airway called Green 1 all the way back to Vancouver. Meanwhile, a nearby aircraft reported poor weather conditions on the radio to air traffic control, including clouds and turbulence between 11,000 and 13,000 feet. This other captain advised the stricken North Star to hold on to as much altitude as possible so as to avoid the bad weather for as long as possible. The Trans-Canada captain thought he could maintain flight level 150, or 15,000 feet. Since declaring the engine fire 9 minutes earlier, Flight 810-9 had lost about 5,000 feet of altitude. 5,000 feet or 1,500 meters in 9 minutes is not an alarming rate of descent. In fact, 600 feet of descent per minute is close to normal for this type of aircraft. Doing the math, 600 feet for 9 minutes is 5,400 feet. So the rate of descent for the North Star was close to normal, but with only 3 engines, that descent rate is somewhat uncontrolled and they could not climb if they wanted to, or if they needed to. Also, there are ragged mountains not too far below that are getting closer and closer. For now, the captain was maintaining flight level 150, or about 4,600 meters. Though voices in the cockpit may have seemed calm, ATC noted that even though the crew had confirmed the Green 1 airway, radar had confirmed the plane was well south of the directed route. ATC queried the aircraft about this, but the reply from the captain was not an acknowledgement of the course error, but that they were nearing Hope, British Columbia. Now, the airway Green 1 has been forever lost to the annals of aviation history. Try as I might, I couldn't find it. I'm sure it has long since been replaced so as to accommodate more modern aircraft and more modern air traffic control procedures. But Hope, British Columbia is still there. And based on its location, it's at what appears to be the entrance to a safe corridor between the mountain ranges that are more or less surrounding Vancouver to the northeast and southeast. My guess is that Green 1 threaded its way along this corridor to guide planes safely between the mountain ranges all the way to Vancouver. Oddly, there was not a call from air traffic control about the course error. 10 minutes went by with the plane remaining off course, with the crew seemingly unaware of the navigation mistake. We'll talk more about this peculiarity in a moment. At 1 hour into this flight, having now been flying 18 minutes on just 3 engines, Flight 810 radioed that they were by Hope. ATC then cleared them to the next waypoint, but to not descend below 8,000 feet due to the mountains. Still, there was no mention from air traffic control about the location and course error of Flight 810-9. Radar showed that the plane was about 12 miles south of Green 1 and 21 miles southeast of Hope at the time radio contact was lost. To further confuse the matter, this is not where the plane was found. Based on rough calculations from the transcript of the conversations between ATC and the crew, either the last radar contact of the plane was wrong, or the plane flew another 25 miles or 40 kilometers to the location where it was eventually found. The crew of the plane undoubtedly thought they were proceeding normally to Vancouver on Green 1, but they were not. Air traffic control attempted additional radio calls to Flight 810, but these attempts went unanswered. Radar also indicated that the plane began to lose altitude rapidly after reporting that their position was near Hope. At that time, their crew requested clearance to descend to 10,000 feet. This request was granted and acknowledged by the crew, but there was nothing else heard from Flight 810-9. This is Radar Contact Lost, the podcast. I'm your host, Dave Gorham. I'm a retired meteorologist with a career in the United States Air Force, commercial and broadcast weather forecasting, with a specialty of aviation meteorology. I've created this podcast series to bring you interesting but tragic stories of airplane crashes that have either been caused by the weather or when the weather has been a contributing factor to the crash. Today's episode, when Trans-Canada Flight 810-9 was on fire, losing altitude and lost over the Cascade Mountains, is about the mid-20th century crash of a packed commercial airliner flying at night during the winter that loses an engine while experiencing icing and turbulence. The crash left no survivors, and it took 5 months to locate the plane. The plane was brought down by the loss of one of the 4 engines, severe icing, subsidence, and turbulence. I'll look at the engines on this plane and see what 69 years of Monday morning quarterbacking can do for us. But of course, I am an aviation meteorologist, so I'll talk about icing and turbulence, as well as subsidence and mountain wave turbulence, all factors in this crash. We'll talk about the airplane, we'll talk about the mountains that the airplane crashed into, Mount Sleacy, and we'll talk about the memorial to the victims of Trans-Canada Flight 810-9, which actually is how this plane crash was brought to my attention. A friend of mine, Paul Robertson, recently made the rugged trek to the memorial site to honor his grandfather, who was on this very Trans-Canada Airlines flight 69 years ago. We'll also talk about what it was like to be a passenger on a commercial airliner in the 1950s. It was not as routine or commonplace as it is today. It was expensive, and not many people had the opportunity to fly commercially in those days. While doing the research for this story, I came across the airline brochures that made mid-century air travel seem so glamorous. There were definitely a few reasons for that. Oh, and stick around until the end of this episode when I'll share a weather term that I've noticed a lot of television weather forecasters using, and that they use it many times without an explanation, or at least without much of an explanation. The term is the atmosphere is capped, or the atmosphere is uncapped. I'll explain what a capped or an uncapped atmosphere is all about. At the beginning of this episode, I told you of the tragic factors involving the crash of Flight 810-9. Let's look at the crash in more detail, and we'll start with the weather. As I began my research, I watched a recap of the 1956 East-West All-Stars Canadian Football League game on YouTube. A football game is seemingly an odd piece of research for an aviation weather podcast, I know. The report aired on the day of the crash, Sunday, December 9th, 1956, and it showed highlights of the All-Stars game from the day before. The game was played in Vancouver, and it was a lopsided game. The West won 35-0. As I mentioned, there were several players from the game on this plane who were returning home. But here's what I found interesting about the report. The black and white video shows men in overcoats sweeping snow off the field and road graders plowing the larger areas. The panning camera showed only a smattering of fans in the stadium seats. The announcer began the broadcast with this descriptive commentary.
According to the Weather Bureau, Vancouver receives an annual precipitation of just under 59 inches. And on this particular day in December, the city is in luck. It's getting all of it today.
This helps describe, I think, the weather situation that was unfolding across southwestern Canada and would affect the plane and the crew of this episode. Before I go any further, let me say that this was not an unusual weather situation. It may have been on the worse side of normal or stronger side of normal, but these storm systems blow in off the Pacific in this area all the time. The pilots should not have been surprised by any aspect of the weather forecast. There were other planes in the area, all reporting on the weather, and this flight, Flight 810-9, had flown westbound into Vancouver only a couple of hours before over the same mountains and experiencing similar weather conditions that the eastbound Flight 810 was now about to experience. The two crews, if time allowed, likely talked about the weather as they traded off the airplane. I looked at the surface analysis for early in the morning of Saturday, December 8th, Sunday, December 9th, the day of the crash, and Monday, December 10th. In a nutshell, the weather charts showed a dire situation. There was a deepening or strengthening low-pressure system just off the coast of Canada's British Columbia, not far from the Queen Charlotte Islands and the southern extent of the state of Alaska. This would place the low in the eastern regions of the Gulf of Alaska. The cyclonic or counterclockwise flow around this strengthening low-pressure system would direct a prolonged, strong, moist onshore flow into coastal southwestern Canada to include Vancouver and the northwestern United States, and well inland into the mountainous regions of the Cascade Mountains. This rich plume of moisture would extend from near the surface up to at least 20,000 feet, or almost 6,100 meters. This is a classic setup for heavy rain and snow throughout this region, and especially on the western slopes of the mountains, which rise nearly immediately upward from the coastline. This is a broad, mountainous region, and the mountains extend inland some 400 miles or more than 650 kilometers. There are some gaps in the mountains, of course, but this area is rugged and desolate for thousands of square miles. Precipitation in this area can vary between snow and rain, even in the middle of winter. While most of Canada receives its heaviest snowfall in January, the Vancouver area experiences its heaviest snowfall in December, though most of the December precipitation here comes in the form of rain. Typically, the air coming off the Pacific is cold, but not usually below freezing. It takes the lifting of the air up the slopes of the mountains to lower the temperature enough to produce snow. Therefore, rain is confined to the lower elevations like the coast, while the higher elevations receive snow, and sometimes it's a lot of snow. The air coming off the Pacific is saturated, so the potential for long periods of rain and snow is high. I checked the temperatures near the coast on the day of the crash, and they were in the 40s. That's Fahrenheit. That would be 4 to 8 degrees Celsius. However, inland temperatures were much colder, down to freezing or below in most areas. Even later in the day on Monday, some 18 hours after the crash, the low center was still offshore and the west and southwest winds were just pumping a fire hose of moisture into this area. A low-pressure system does not exist solely on the surface. It has structure all the way up into the higher reaches of the troposphere, which is the lowest level of Earth's atmosphere. Looking at the strength of this weather system, I could easily estimate winds approaching 100 miles per hour, or about 160 kilometers per hour, at flight levels between 15,000 and 20,000 feet. I could also easily forecast clouds and precipitation, solid from near the surface all the way up to 20,000 feet or higher. Flight 810-9, even with the unique pressurized cabin of the North Star, would not fly higher than 20,000 feet for this flight, although the service ceiling for the North Star was just under 30,000 feet. So, what did Flight 810-9 encounter? I don't think you need to be an aviation meteorologist to know that the weather would be very difficult to fly in. Despite the precipitation and the wind, taking off might not be too bad, and the landing should have been no issue, as the weather was good at the North Star's next stop in Calgary. But getting from point A to point B across the mountains would require great skill and talent on the part of the crew, perhaps a bit of nerve as well. From my perspective, the weather forecast for this flight could have been the type to keep the plane on the ground. However, as I mentioned, this type of weather was not unusual. Low-pressure systems like this move across the North Pacific with regularity, and if flights were grounded each time, there would be a lot of cancellations. A delay of a few hours or even a day wouldn't be of much help, so the plane took off. All the hallmarks of bad weather en route were there: strong winds, dense clouds, abundant precipitation, and freezing temperatures. The question then becomes, how bad would it be? Well, the flight level winds were strong, approaching 100 knots. Aviation forecasters would likely anticipate areas of severe turbulence and would likely brief the pilot with something like moderate, occasional severe turbulence from 10,000 feet to 20,000 feet, maybe even higher. The aviation meteorologist there would likely have an intimate knowledge of the mountains so that he or she could suggest a more favorable route of flight to minimize the exposure to the turbulence. Turbulence is at its worst when the winds are perpendicular to the mountains. And since the mountains in that area are generally aligned north-south, and the winds were generally from the southwest that night, that alignment could take some of the intensity out of the turbulence, a few pockets of severe here and there, but the moderate turbulence would be constant all night. Again, knowledge of the local area would be key. These winds, by the way, would be a tailwind, so the flight would make good time to its first stop in Calgary. There was another factor to the wind coming over the mountains, and that would be subsidence, or sinking air rolling over the tops of the mountains. Subsidence is common in mountainous areas, but typically gets lumped in with mountain wave turbulence. Air flowing up and over a mountain will typically roll and tumble its way down the other side, so the sinking air of subsidence can often be bumpy. That downward flowing air can literally hold an airplane down, or to put it another way, subsidence can prevent an airplane from climbing upward. And one more thing about the wind. Once the crippled North Star turned around to head back to Vancouver, which it did when it declared the engine fire, the strong tailwinds became strong headwinds. This took needed performance away from the plane, making a bad situation even worse. As for the precipitation, it would be almost constant and at times heavy. There would be icing in clouds and in precipitation above 8,000 feet or above 2,400 meters. Icing intensity and type would vary depending on the thickness of the clouds and the intensity of the precipitation, but it likely would be in the moderate category most of the time, though at times it would likely be severe. It would be rime icing in the clouds and clear icing in the precipitation. Clear icing can build up quickly and needs to be closely monitored and removed by the crew. Rime icing is less dense and accumulates less quickly than clear icing. I'll talk about the de-icing equipment on the North Star in a few minutes, but I'm sure the capabilities of this airplane would have been sufficient for most situations except severe icing. Most airplanes are not capable of fighting their way through extended periods of severe icing. Most pilots will opt to leave the area of severe icing immediately. Except on this night, the North Star was crippled with the loss of one engine. With the headwinds, the subsidence, and the accumulating ice, it was unable to climb away from the mountains below or to make much progress in getting away from the icing. A large, powerful 4-engine airliner like the North Star should not have any issues with subsidence or most type of icing. A healthy airplane like this would have been high enough to avoid the subsidence and most of the turbulence and icing. Bumpy and uncomfortable? Sure. De-icing equipment working full-time? Sure. Nervous passengers? Probably so. However, with one engine out, plus experiencing icing conditions, being low enough to be battling subsidence and strong turbulence while flying in snow and lost at night, the fate of Flight 810-9 was already written on the vertical walls of Mount Sleacy. On board TransCanada Flight 810-9, there was a captain, a first officer, and a flight attendant. The North Star had a flight deck position for a flight engineer, but that position was vacant on that flight. Had there been early indications of the conditions that caused the engine fire, a flight engineer may have been able to catch that situation early before it became crippling to the airplane. The PIC, or the pilot in command, was named Alan Clark. He was a highly experienced pilot and a former Royal Air Force bomber commander who had flown 47 combat missions during World War II. Clark was known for adhering strictly to flight plans, so after reporting the engine fire, it's surprising that he looped around to the right instead of to the left to return to Vancouver. This put him too far south of Air Route Green 1. Ultimately, it was this wrong turn that put the plane in a dangerous location with dangerous weather, all while the crew thought they knew where they were. As to this wrong turn, the official accident report said, quote, For undetermined reasons, the aircraft was not on Green Airway Number 1, to which it had been cleared by air traffic control, unquote. Nothing else was mentioned in the report. The first officer, Terry Boone, was handling the radio and the communications that night, so he was involved in acknowledging air traffic control instructions during the flight. Like Captain Clark, he did not detect the navigational error when the aircraft turned away from the intended Green 1 airway, despite cockpit navigation equipment like compasses and radio beacons that would have indicated the error. The flight attendant on Flight 810-9 was Dorothy Bjornsson. The plane in this story, the Canadair North Star, is a version of one of the first superstars of post-war commercial aviation, the Douglas DC-4. Remember, prior to World War II, air travel was rare and infrequent. It was only with a surplus of aircraft and pilots after the war that air travel began to become more common. Yet it was expensive, and only a very small number of passengers would opt for the new form of travel. I'll talk a little bit more and shed some interesting light on what air travel was like in the mid-20th century in a chapter coming up in just a little bit. The Canadian manufacturer, Canadair, developed the North Star from the Douglas DC-4. The American DC-4 was a 4-engine, propeller-driven airliner that could seat about 55 to 60 passengers. The military version, the C-54 Skymaster, played a huge role in World War II as a freighter and a troop transport. Later, it was the primary aircraft used during the Berlin blockade, when Russia surrounded West Germany following World War II, and the Allies flew supplies into the isolated city of Berlin. The plane was very fuel inefficient and not very reliable. The Army could throw all the fuel they wanted at it and had plenty of mechanics to keep it flying, despite its problems. But when the airlines took over the plane after the war, they had a list of so many issues that Douglas practically started with a clean sheet to design a new DC-4. The redesign was somewhat smaller and it was more simple, and it was actually this redesign that became the new Canadair North Star. By the time Canadair took the design from Douglas, World War II was over. The Canadian manufacturer knew that they had to make additional changes to make the North Star more cost-effective. The original DC-4 engine used 14-cylinder radial piston engines from Pratt & Whitney. Canadair, in an effort to gain some fuel efficiency, a bit more reliability, and more speed, made the significant switch to the mighty Merlin V12 engine. If that name sounds familiar, then you may remember it from World War II, or perhaps from its dominance in air racing after the war, or perhaps from the custom-built Rolls-Royce automobile that belongs to Jay Leno. Or maybe you've seen the P-51 Mustangs flying at air shows and just love the sound of that big engine. There are more than a few stories about the V-12 Merlin winning World War II for the Allies, especially as the engine drove not only the famed P-51 Mustang, but also the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire, among many others. Although, as an interesting side note, more Merlin engines went into the 4-engine Lancaster bombers than ever went into the single-engine fighters. So Canadair swaps out the 14-cylinder radial for the 12-cylinder V. Horsepower goes up to nearly 1,500 compared to about 1,000 horsepower in the radial engine. That's for each of the 4 engines on the North Star. One drawback of the Merlin, however, required some modifications. The new 12-cylinder engines were much louder than the radial Pratt & Whitneys, and at least 12 exhaust ports were pointing directly at the passengers inside the plane, with only a relatively thin sheet of aluminum between them and more than 1,500 horsepower. These engines were so loud that Canadair decided to build a special exhaust ducting to direct all that racket away from the fuselage and the passengers. The effort was actually quite effective, though it was still quite loud inside and outside. Canadair made several additional changes to the already extensive list of changes made after the war in the United States. Canadair's changes would include a new nose, a new mid and rear fuselage, a new empennage, which is the section at the rear that holds the horizontal and vertical stabilizers. There were also new flaps, new wingtips, new center and outer wing panels, a different cockpit layout with an all-new, all-electric system, And finally, Canadair added cabin pressurization, which would allow the plane to fly substantially higher than the unpressurized DC-4 while maintaining passenger comfort at higher altitudes. These changes may make you wonder why Canadair didn't just build a whole new airplane. Well, they basically did, and they gave it a new name, the Canadair North Star, to indicate that it was not a DC-4. The North Star was introduced in 1946, and the last civil operator retired the plane in 1975. So, a run for the airliner of 29 years. The North Star was outfitted with de-icing equipment, though the specifics of what was installed was difficult for me to find. For a modern airliner of the day, with passenger safety and comfort a top priority, Canadair would not have skimped in this area. The standard de-icing equipment would likely be present. That would include inflatable boots along the leading edges of the wing, so as the ice accumulated, the boots would inflate and crack the ice, which would then be blown away by the wind. The blades of the propellers would likely be electrically heated. The fuel system would have been heated as well. The V-12 Merlin pushed the famed P-51 Mustang to altitudes above 40,000 feet, or a bit more than 12,000 meters, much higher than the North Star was ever designed to achieve. So the engine was definitely well protected from cold and ice. Another crucial item would be a heated windshield, so the pilot and co-pilot would have an unobstructed view, not only to the front, but likely to the sides as well, so that they could check for accumulating ice on the wings. A surefire way to spot the North Star, compared to its only slightly larger sister, the DC-4, is the exhaust pipes of the V-12 Merlin engines. These short, stubby pipes extended in a horizontal row behind the propellers of the North Star. You'll see 6 on each side of the V-12 engine. Although, due to the noise, as I mentioned earlier, Canadair added some angular ducting to direct the noise away from the fuselage. After that addition, the 6 stubby pipes were out of sight. Unlike the North Star, the DC-4's engine cowling is smooth and polished behind the propellers, with large exhaust pipes coming out from under the engine. Overall, the under exhaust was a much more quiet configuration for the passengers on a DC-4. I think it's a fair bet to say that the only North Stars you'll see today will be in pictures, as there is only one example surviving. This last North Star resides at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa, Ontario. I mentioned the engines in the previous chapter, but given the engine fire of Flight 810-9, which sets this whole sequence of events into action, I had to wonder if the North Star's Merlin V-12, manufactured by Rolls-Royce, was prone to fire. After all, the engine fire on TransCanada's Flight 810-9 seemed to flare up suddenly, and the crew gave no indication of why or how the fire came to be. The famous British engine came online in 1933, and more than 168,000 of them were produced before production was shuttered in 1950. Each version was improved and refined. However, early versions of the engine did have some problems with excessive wear and head cracking. There was no specific mention of fire that I could find, with one notable exception. The engine coolant in the early models was quite flammable. This was indeed a problem when the planes were being shot at, as often happened during the war. Later models used less flammable coolant. Engine fires in commercial service after the war were rare. I checked the accident investigation report for Flight 810-9. There was no reason given for the fire of engine number 2, but like much of the aircraft itself, the engines were obliterated on impact, and there wasn't much left to investigate. What about navigation? Navigation factors heavily into this story because Flight 810-9 was well off its intended course. The crew had the equipment to not only indicate the course and help keep them on it, but also to sound an alarm if the plane strayed off course. Yet it seemed none of this was of any help. Even today, the reason for Flight 810-9 to be off course is unknown, but there are several scenarios worth examining. Here's the first one. It's thought that an initial clearance to a different route, Air Route Red 44, could have put Flight 810-9 in kind of a betwixt and between situation. Red 44 required a higher minimum altitude and took the plane farther south and farther away from Green 1. But with the difficulty in maintaining the altitude needed for Red 44, Flight 810-9 asked to return to Green 1, and air traffic control did give that clearance. To add a layer of confusion and uncertainty to this scenario, there was another plane in the area, that same one that gave the report of bad weather to the crew of Flight 810, as I mentioned earlier. The exact location of this other airplane was unknown, so it's thought that perhaps Flight 810-9 gave it a wide berth to the south of Green 1 so as to avoid a potential collision. Again, it was dark, it was windy, it was snowing, it was turbulent, and at least one of the two aircraft was having trouble maintaining altitude. So a wide berth was likely a good idea. A positive location for the second airplane took several minutes, so perhaps only then did Flight 810 attempt to return to Green 1 and therefore becoming somewhat behind the eight ball, as it were. Another potential complication would have been drift. Flight 810-9 was bucking some serious headwinds as it tried to return to Vancouver. It's estimated that, depending on the exact altitude, the winds could have been 85 to 100 knots from the west-southwest. If 810-9 was following, or attempting to follow, or attempting to return to Green 1, then the winds would be pushing the plane off course to the pilot's right, or to the starboard side of the aircraft. Additionally, with one engine out, the captain would have to steer the plane a little bit differently because of the thrust difference from the remaining three engines. Two engines on one side of the plane, just one on the other. In this case, with the engine closest to the pilot shut down and more thrust on the other side of the airplane, the plane would want to drift to the port side or to the pilot's left. The crew can configure the plane to fly both of these scenarios to accommodate the push to the right from the wind and the drift to the left from the difference in thrust. But it just becomes more difficult to fly the plane where the captain wanted it to go. Plus, being off course means the Green 1 radio signal that the plane was attempting to follow was weak or weaker. These radio signals are strongest right down the center of the airway and weaker off to the sides. It's designed this way. If the pilot notices that the directional signal or beacon is getting weaker, the pilot knows to steer back to where the signal is strongest. Perhaps, given all the issues that were stacking up against Flight 810, they were doing the best they could, but it just wasn't enough. If you're a pilot, you may be wondering about interference or signal strength of the navigation and communication frequencies. After all, it was mountainous and there was abundant precipitation. Under ideal conditions, there should be no problems with interference or signal strength. However, given the conditions that night, it's thought that the reception before the crash was likely significantly degraded, if not completely zero. There were several other pilots flying that night, and they all reported some, but minor, interference. It's highly unlikely the crew of Flight 810-9 had an accurate fix on their position due to the degraded frequency performance. Let's talk about autopilot, as it may have played a role in this crash. Although it was 1956, this plane was equipped with autopilot. And you may be surprised to know that the first autopilot was fitted to an airplane in 1912. The device installed on the North Star was known as the PB-10. I couldn't find much history on the PB-10, but I found that it was standard equipment on B-17 bombers, so it goes back at least to the first days of World War II. I also found that it is included on much more modern aircraft, like the B-737, the 747, the 777, and even military airplanes like the F-15 Strike Eagle, the F-35 Lightning, and the FA-18 Hornet. The North Star was the first commercial airliner equipped with Flight Path Control, or FPC. FPC was designed as a supplement to autopilot. Autopilot itself could keep the plane flying straight and level, but it could not keep a plane on a predetermined ground track or flight path. That's where FPC came in. In those early days of aviation, it took 3 instruments to keep a plane on track: the PB-10, the FPC, and the ILS, or the Instrument Landing System. If this sounds complicated, it is, unless you're a trained pilot who makes his or her living flying airplanes and navigating the globe. Autopilot today has advanced significantly since its early days. Today, a flight around the world can be almost entirely hands-off by the crew, handled entirely by autopilot, leaving only takeoffs and landings to the pilots. In the mid-20th century, given that it was new technology, again, the North Star was the first commercial airliner to have flight path control, how well was FPC understood by the crew, and were they even using it at the time of the crash? The first airplanes equipped with cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders, otherwise known as the black boxes, were still some 10 or so years away, so we will never know what caused or allowed the plane to be so far off course. And one more thing about autopilot. As of now, there is no autopilot system that can land or take off an airplane without human input and monitoring. Though I believe the most sophisticated autopilots can land and take off on their own, there is no country that currently allows this. To take autopilot one step further, there is no commercial airliner that is fully autonomous. However, in November of 2023, a company called Reliable Robotics completed a fully autonomous FAA-sanctioned flight. The plane took off without a pilot or human on board, completed the entire test, and landed with total autonomy. Was the North Star a safe airplane? We've asked this question several times about almost all the airplanes examined here on Radar Contact Lost. In order to answer that question with a yes or a no, we have to understand the time period in which the plane was flown. Was it a safe plane by today's standards? Perhaps not. Was it a safe plane by 1956 standards? Mostly yes. The North Star had a good safety record with minimal fatalities. From 1950 to 1952, during the Korean War, the Royal Canadian Air Force used North Stars to ferry supplies from Canada to Korea across the Pacific Ocean. They flew 599 round trips, delivered 7 million pounds of cargo, and 13,000 personnel. They flew 1.9 million miles without a fatal crash. Of the 71 North Stars built, there were 6 incidents with approximately 219 fatalities. Similarly, the Douglas DC-4, along with its military variants, the C-54 and the R-5D, it was considered a safe and reliable airplane for its day. Due to its Army service life and longer production run, there were almost 1,200 DC-4s produced. Due to its extensive wartime service, attributing a number of fatalities to the aircraft is impossible, while Wikipedia lists a fairly long list of known accidents, incidents, and fatalities. I want to mention a safety feature on the airplane that I don't think I've ever mentioned before: the seatbelts. Interestingly, of the 62 people on board Flight 810-9, the accident report indicated only 1 seatbelt was buckled. All the other seatbelts were found to be unbuckled with no damage to the webbing and in a state that suggested that they were not in use at the time of the crash. This certainly indicates a difference in how seatbelts are viewed today as compared to how they were viewed 70 years ago. The unfastened seatbelts also suggested that the crash was unexpected, that the crash was sudden and catastrophic, and that there was no warning from the crew to the passengers. I want to look more closely at the crash, and I will in a few moments, but I want to mention where this crash occurred, because this is part of the identity of this crash, just like the airplane, the weather, and the crew. The plane crashed in a very rugged and remote area of the Cascade Mountains in western Canada, just a couple of miles north of the USA-Canada border and the state of Washington. The crash was about 71 miles or 114 kilometers east-southeast of its revised destination, Vancouver. The mountain where the remains of the plane were found is named Mount Sleacy. It's a tall, vertical mountain located in Fraser Valley, British Columbia. Its highest point is 8,002 feet, which is 2,439 meters. The nearest town is Chilliwack, British Columbia. It's about 20 miles direct, that's about 32 kilometers, or it's about an hour by car. It is possible to reach the crash site, but it's a rugged hike, one that's recommended for experienced hikers. Although the website besthikesbc.ca rates the hike as moderate, with the reviewer stating, quote, "I'd be hard-pressed to call this a particularly difficult hike," unquote. It's a hike rated at about 6 to 7 hours for slow hikers, with an elevation gain of 1,000 meters. It's recommended that a high-clearance 4x4 vehicle be used to reach the trailhead access point. It's also recommended to wait until summer when the access road and the trail are free of snow. I actually think I'd like to try this hike, so to my hiking friends Rich, Todd, Gene, and Mike, consider yourself warned. The crash location is so remote, and the weather was so bad, in fact, that the efforts for a rescue and recovery were abandoned shortly after the crash. Remember, there was an ongoing strong storm, a series of strong storms underway. The plane and the bodies of the crash victims still remain, though I have to wonder after so many years, could human remains still be there? With so much snow and ice, I wonder. Early on after the crash, it had been decided that the crash site would become, quote, "a cemetery in perpetuity," but it wasn't officially a protected site until 1995, 39 years later. At that time, the government of British Columbia enacted legislation to create the Mount Sleacy Commemorative Site. Any damage, desecration, or removal of any remains, debris, or other materials was then considered a punishable offense. I mentioned this at the top of the episode. It took 5 months to locate the crash, from December to May. The crash was hindered initially because of the remoteness of the site and the weather. It was winter and the crash occurred in the midst of an extended succession of storms. But it was also delayed because rescuers were searching on the wrong mountain. Based on what was one of the last radar contacts, rescuers initially were searching on Silvertip Mountain, a site nearly 20 miles to the northeast of Mount Sleacy. None of my research indicated if the crash site was found by accident or if it was by a dedicated team of searchers specifically looking for the North Star on Mount Sleacy. I was also unable to find any indication of what led the searchers to stop searching on Silvertip, or if that search was still underway when the crash site was discovered on Mount Sleacy. The beauty of this area is incredible. A simple internet search will lead you to stunning photos of Mount Sleacy. This audio podcast can't do justice to the grandeur of seeing Mount Sleacy in person or even seeing it on video. But it may help you to know that the word Sleacy means fang, F-A-N-G, fang, in the language of the First Nations peoples of the British Columbia coast. The wreckage was found on Mount Sleacy at about 7,600 feet of altitude, or just over 2,300 meters. The initial impact was just 50 feet below the peak of what was the third highest peak of Mount Sleacy. There were many small, smashed pieces of the plane on a small, protruding shelf near the impact site. The rest of the wreckage slid 2,000 feet down a rock face to a snow-covered field below. It was determined that no one survived the initial impact. Though the crash location was found in May, the summer months of June, July, and most of August were cold, rainy, and cloudy. These weather conditions made helicopter flying difficult, if not impossible. But by the last week of August, more than 7 months after the crash, a helicopter was finally able to reach the field where most of the wreckage was located, and the examination of the plane could be finally concluded. It was a dangerous location. Not only were there steep rock walls, some still covered in ice, but much of the lower fields were still covered in snow, and there were vertical drops near the wreckage that kept the investigators alert as they completed their tasks. One of the ways investigators confirmed that the plane was running on 3 engines, not 4, was by examining the propellers. 3 propellers were smashed to bits, while the remaining propeller was relatively undamaged and remained attached to the hub of the engine. The severely damaged blades of the running engines were also noted to have notches, scratches, and cuts along the leading edges. These findings indicate that 3 engines were running with spinning propellers and that 1 propeller was not spinning when it impacted the rock wall near the top of Mount Sleacy. I mentioned earlier that the seatbelts of the North Star were found at the accident site to be in an unused condition, suggesting the crash was sudden and without warning. When investigators reached the site, they were surprised at the total destruction of the airplane. The plane hit a rock face at a speed much higher than what the limping 3-engine plane flying into a headwind could muster on its own. This suggests that it struck the wall at a downward angle while gathering speed. Though investigators stopped short of saying that the plane was in a vertical dive, they did say the plane was losing altitude rapidly. There was no indication of a fire at the impact site, and the evidence suggests that the plane was in one piece when it impacted the mountain. Fuel starvation did not seem to be an issue, as the plane was early into its flight to Calgary. But based on the crash site evidence, the plane did not fly level into the mountain face. Something caused the plane to leave its level but limping forward track and begin plunging to the ground. The investigators are not ruling out any additional malfunction or multiple malfunctions, but the crash was so completely destructive and the site was so difficult to reach that all the parts of the airplane have not been found. They even noted that some parts of the plane were, quote, beyond reach, unquote. This idea was not mentioned by the accident report, but from my perspective, if the icing overwhelmed the plane's de-icing equipment and the crew was unable to shed the accumulating ice, the plane would eventually lose lift and fall from the sky. This could help explain the tremendous speed with which the North Star struck Mount Sleacy. The crash into the mountain was so powerful that parts of the airplane are embedded into the rock face. I've mentioned a couple of times so far that the plane was tracked by radar. As I was researching this story, I kept thinking about the air traffic controllers and why they were not interjecting to help Flight 810-9 get back onto Green 1 or to help them fixate their position. It's like they were watching this slow-motion disaster and they were doing nothing to stop it. And by slow motion, I mean that from when Flight 810 declared the fire and then turned around to head back to Vancouver to the last transmission from Flight 810, it was almost 20 minutes. Just what the heck were those air traffic controllers doing that they couldn't provide the needed or perhaps even the required assistance? As soon as I had that thought, that the assistance to the troubled airplane would be required, I thought I had better check in with our team of air traffic controllers here on the podcast. Each of them have their specialties. Tony and Michael were tower controllers, but Cindy has radar experience, and so I asked her what to make of this situation. Here's what she said. This was back in 1956, and this aircraft was not being controlled by a radar controller. The pilot was flying only by reporting his position and location to air traffic control. In 1956, Canada did not have the radar structure that they have today. In 1956, they were just starting to discuss and outline installations. Without radar, this pilot was en route and reporting in at fixed positions, and this is how air traffic control would track the airplane. This was how it was done at that time, but especially so in remote locations. As for the radar tracking, this was not being done by an air traffic facility. The Trans-Canada North Star was being tracked by a U.S. Air Force radar station using radar not for air traffic, but for detection and interception of hostile targets. This radar location was the Blaine Air Force Station at Birch Bay, Washington. Remember, this was during the midst of the Cold War, and the United States had ideally situated the Blaine Station to track Russian aircraft or missiles that would be approaching the northwestern United States. This was not an air traffic facility, and they did not have an air traffic control function. But they did see and track the Trans-Canada flight, just like they saw and tracked many other commercial and general aviation aircraft in the area. Thank you for helping me understand that, Cindy. It makes total sense. I'm glad I checked in with you. The Blaine Station used an AN/FPS-10 radar for the purpose of defense and interception of fighter aircraft at relatively low aspects on the horizon. The radar itself was from the same family of radar equipment that I used for weather detection. That was the AN/FPS-77, and I used that in the 1970s and the 1980s. But the two units were significantly different. For example, the weather radar I used took one person to operate. The intercept radar at Blaine Station needed 25 people. Earlier, while learning of the steps that Canadair took to shield or insulate the passengers of North Star aircraft from the raucous sound made by the Merlin engines, it made me wonder what else commercial airline passengers were exposed to back in the waning days of propeller airliners and the early days of jet travel. Was it fun? Was it expensive? Was it luxurious? Was it uncomfortable? The short answer is yes. It was all of that and more. Air travel in the 1950s was a mix of glamour, novelty, but even some inconvenience as compared to today. It was the dawn of the jet age with propeller-driven aircraft like the Douglas DC-6 and the Lockheed Constellation dominating early in the decade, while the first commercial jet, the de Havilland Comet, was introduced in 1952. Flights were slower. Transatlantic trips took 12 to 15 hours with multiple refueling stops. These flights were also noisy, and with unpressurized cabins on many planes, there was discomfort at higher altitudes. The Boeing 707 made its first flight at the end of 1957, and it began cutting travel times and making air travel more efficient. Its pressurized cabin allowed a comfortable flight at altitudes nearing 40,000 feet, or almost 13,000 meters. Tickets were expensive, so flying was mostly for the wealthy, the business traveler, or government officials. A round-trip transatlantic flight could cost $500 to $600 in 1956. That's about $6,000 to $7,000 in 2025. Despite the cost, or perhaps because of the cost, airlines marketed a luxury experience. Spacious seats, gourmet meals, lobster and prime rib, and free-flowing cocktails were often featured in the cabin. They were served on real china and with real cloth napkins, all served by attentive stewardesses. And by the way, the title of flight attendant began to be phased in around the late 1970s. Back in the 1950s, passengers dressed up. Men wore suits, women were in dresses and hats, smoking was allowed on board, the seats were wider and generally more spacious. Even the economy seats were more generously proportioned than today. But then what seat wasn't? Airports were smaller and less crowded, and they lacked modern security. You could walk straight to the gate. But flights were far from reliable in the 1950s, even with the newest planes. Delays and cancellations were common due to mechanical issues. Safety was a concern. Accident rates were much higher than today. Air traffic control was just beginning to lay the early ground and air networks that would dramatically improve safety and efficiency over the coming decades. Today, as we've seen in recent news pieces, these systems are beginning to show their age. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, was not formed until 1958, 2 years after this crash. Prior to the FAA, the CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board, was the governing body in the United States for aviation at the time. But the CAB was more about regulating airlines and safety, not really about air traffic control. Navigation, as we've already talked about, was rudimentary. Flights were bumpier because the propeller airliners of the time could not climb high enough to clear most of the turbulence. Not only were the planes lower and exposed to more weather, but the weather forecasting of the day was, believe it or not as good as it is today. Many forecasting principles we take for granted today really didn't come about until the 1980s and the 1990s. Also, there was little in the way of in-flight entertainment, except, get this, there were sometimes live bands in the lounge. I find that amazing. Movies were sometimes played in the lounge as well, but that is somehow less surprising to me than a live band. I just can't imagine. The flights were long. Even the big propeller airliners like the Boeing 377 took 7 to 8 hours to cross the United States, or up to 20 hours for transatlantic flights. The planes had to stop every few hours for fuel. It wasn't until the larger, faster, higher-flying jetliners came along that air travel began to resemble what we have today. By 1959, air travel was growing, about 50 million passengers globally, compared to the billions of passengers flying today. As flying became more popular and commonplace, the nature of the air travel experience began to change. By the end of the 1950s, America's airlines were bringing a new level of speed, comfort, and efficiency to the traveling public. However, with the steady increase in passenger traffic, the level of personal service decreased. The popular sleeper service was eliminated as speedy, low-fare, overnight flights could cross the country relatively quickly. So began what was called the red eye, where red-eyed, sleepless passengers would greet the new day in a new city in a new time zone. The stresses of air travel began to replace the thrill of air travel. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, flying was no longer a novelty. It was becoming a necessity. The airlines were deregulated in 1978. This drove prices down, introduced new airlines, and competition swelled. It also opened up air travel to nearly anyone. With the intense security following 9/11, flying commercially in the present day would look unrecognizable to someone from 1956. Perhaps the biggest hardship for travelers in the 1950s, that one of the greatest and most significant inventions of all air travel was still 20 to 25 years away. Suitcases with the little wheels on the bottom. And one more thing about flying comfort. Even though the discomfort of unpressurized cabins was now a thing of the past, passengers began experiencing a different sort of discomfort: jet lag. These physiological problems were caused by crossing several time zones within just a few hours. Days and nights that were shortened or lengthened because of air travel upset the natural body rhythms and made sleeping difficult. The term jet lag came about as more and more people were exposed to the condition, but this was first experienced before jets, because even after long-distance trips on the slower piston-engine airliners, the symptoms of jet lag were being experienced. We've improved the airplanes, and certainly the positive aspects of air travel have continued, but it seems that a large part of the flying experience has not improved at all. In fact, it seems to have gone the other way. Most of us now dread the need to fly and will easily admit it's the worst part of a vacation or business trip. And one more thing I should clarify. I made a statement earlier about mechanical reliability being taken for granted today. I don't think that any pilot takes any aspect of his or her airplane for granted. There are many airplanes flying today that are decades old, and their engines are decades old. And in many cases, they are many decades old. There are regulations that dictate when maintenance is to be performed and when inspections of the aircraft are to be performed. As much as it can be, nothing is left to chance when it comes to flying high above the ground. I'm sure lots of pilots will make strong arguments for the older engines, that because they are older, they are more simple and easier to operate and repair, as long as you stay on top of the maintenance. Newer engines bring newer technology and may in fact be more reliable than decades ago. But even with newer engines and newer airplanes, nothing is left to chance. Nothing is taken for granted. That said, pilots flying today can probably breathe a bit easier than pilots of 50, 60, or 70 years ago, knowing that their airplanes have the benefits of decades of improvements in technology, manufacturing, and materials. That's all for this time on Radar Contact Lost, the podcast. Thanks for listening. But don't go just yet. In a moment, I'll explain what a capped or uncapped atmosphere is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. But first, let me take this opportunity to thank the team of pilots, air traffic controllers, and meteorologists here at Radar Contact Lost. They help make this podcast thorough and accurate. A special thanks to Sydney Hintz, who provided her knowledge of air traffic control, radar stations, and a bit of Cold War history. Cindy kept me from blaming air traffic control for not stepping in to save Flight 810-9 by explaining that there was no radar control of air traffic in those days. Also, a special shout out to Joe Spain at Risk Consulting. Joe provided some of the weather data from 1956 that I used for this story. Joe is happy to report he has launched a new website, riskconsulting.com. Check it out and you'll understand why he is the perfect source for the really old weather data that I sometimes need to reconstruct these stories. That's Risk Consulting, and Risk is spelled W-R-I-S-K. Thanks, Joe. As I've done before, I'd again like to share a few podcast statistics with you. The previous episode about the 1982 plane crash next to the New Orleans airport tied the 7-day download record, but fell short of the 30-day download record. That was a bit of a bummer, but the previous episode, the one about the pilot errors during the season's first snowstorm in Denver in 1987, that just set the 90-day download record, so the records are still coming. These download records are all you, the listeners. You are doing the heavy lifting, or maybe I should say the heavy listening. And so I want to thank you all for listening and recommending this podcast to your friends. It seems we're gathering a few new listeners almost every day. And one more note, this was the first time I've used AI to help my research. Specifically, I used it to dig up some details about what flying in the 1950s was like. I also asked it to help me with the de-icing equipment used on the North Star. I was having difficulty with that, but AI pulled up a lot of sources that I could not find. I did find several sources, but they were behind paywalls, and so that stopped me. AI came up with that information, paywall or not. So thank you, Grok. Now, before I wrap this up, let me talk about what I promised at the beginning of the episode, a capped or an uncapped atmosphere. It's a term that I have noticed television meteorologists like to use, especially in thunderstorm-prone areas like the southern United States. And since I used to be one of those television meteorologists in the southern United States, I have used that term on occasion myself. I think viewers in the southern USA are very tuned into the weather, especially severe weather, and probably have a weather knowledge based on experience. But if you're new to the South or just want to expand your weather knowledge, then perhaps you'll find this informative. A capped or uncapped atmosphere is the ability or lack of ability for air in the atmosphere to rise. For a weather forecaster, knowing when air can rise or knowing when it can't is critical in knowing if thunderstorms will form or if they can't form at all. Warm, rising air cools as it rises, and if it rises and cools enough, clouds will form. If there's enough humidity in that rising air, then not only clouds, but rain and perhaps even thunderstorms will form. None of that will happen, however, if the atmosphere is capped. A capped atmosphere occurs when the rising air is prevented from rising, and that depends on how the atmosphere at the time is thermally structured. I think most of us know that the atmosphere gets colder with altitude, and that's generally true, but there are actually times when that is not true. There are times when parts of the atmosphere become warmer with height. Warm air cannot rise in warm air. Warm air rises in cool or cold air. There has to be contrast between the warm air and the cold. Take away that contrast and nothing will happen. Warm air won't move up and cool air won't move down. So a capped atmosphere prevents or limits upward vertical motion, while an uncapped atmosphere allows that air to rise at will. Well, how does the atmosphere warm with altitude? The classic scenario is when a big, strong, high-pressure center moves over an area or a region and stays there. This is common in the summertime. High-pressure systems are comprised of sinking, dense air. That air, as it sinks, compresses and dries, and as it compresses, it warms. There will be no rising air here. Warm air cannot rise into warm air. That means no clouds, no rain, no thunderstorms. This is what is called a capped environment. But as that high pressure moves away and is replaced with a low pressure system, that changes. Low pressure systems are characterized by rising, cooler air and lots of humidity. Here, warm air near the surface will rise and become surrounded by cool or cold air. The temperature contrast will be significant, and warm air will accelerate upward. Clouds, rain, thunderstorms will likely be abundant. This is an uncapped environment or atmosphere. So there you have it, capped and uncapped. Capping the atmosphere brings a lack of rising air, no precipitation, no clouds. An uncapped environment allows that air to rise, and we'll see clouds, rain, and maybe even thunderstorms. On Instagram, follow @Radar Contact Loss Podcast. There I provide behind the scenes, time schedules, interesting factoids, and more. If you'd like to reach out, send an email to rclpodcast1@gmail.com. That's rclpodcast, the number 1, @gmail.com. Or send a text through your podcast app. Your name and contact information used on that texting app remains anonymous. With each new episode of Radar Contact Lost, I will bring you interesting but tragic stories of plane crashes from around the United States and from around the world. When these crashes involve the weather as a possible cause or as a contributing factor, I'll rely on my 40-year career as an Air Force, broadcast, and commercial meteorologist with a specialty of aviation meteorology to explain what happened and why. I'll also lean on my experts in meteorology, air traffic control, and piloting to peel back the curtain to take a closer look at what really happened. Lastly, let me again thank you, the listeners. I'm so excited with every upload of every new episode, and I hope you are too. I'm very happy to bring these stories to all of you who have a love of weather, aviation, and history, just like me. Thanks for climbing aboard and settling in for the latest from the Radar Contact Loss team of Chris, Joe, Cindy, Michael, Tony, Larry, Michelle, and me. I'm Dave Gorham.